Boris Johnson came in at a good time to remind everyone that this isn't just political games here that's happening in Europe. We've got to make sure that Ukraine wins, and the U.S. is part of that.
Boris Johnson has used a speech in the US to drum up support for Ukraine. In a speech at the Atlantic Council, the former Prime Minister said he supported Ukraine joining NATO and that Ukraine should be given what it needs as fast as possible. Jim Townsend is a former Vice President of the Atlantic Council and former Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO. I asked him first what he made of Boris Johnson's appearance in the US.
His appearance was very good. It's interesting. Because he's no longer prime minister, he didn't arrive with a ruffles and flourishes and limousines. He spoke at the Atlantic Council, and the audience there was very appreciative. He had a great urgency in his voice, and spoke with a lot of passion, and certainly made his case to an audience that's heard it all before. But I think certainly not with the passion that I think Boris Johnson brought to how urgent things are right now.
And does he come with moral authority with you? Because on one hand, he really has led the charge on Ukraine throughout his tenure as Prime Minister. On the other, his tenure as Prime Minister ended in something of a disgrace in this country. Has his position, his authority been compromised in any way?
I don't think so. I think all of us in Washington, we know Boris Johnson and we know his career, but I think it's probably more deeply felt in the UK than in Washington, where what he said had resonance. I think here in Washington, we are concerned about the House of Representatives and the Republicans there who might be putting up a bit of a fight about, assistance to Ukraine. I think Boris Johnson came in at a good time to remind everyone that this isn't just political games here that's happening in Europe. We've got to make sure that Ukraine wins, and the U.S. is part of that. And so it was good to hear him remind us of that in some pretty stirring words.
Why are the Republican Party a bit soft on Ukraine? And does that reflect public mood in any way? Because the war is now almost exactly a year old. Is it fatigue? Is it concern over some of the corruption endemic in Ukraine? Is it just an unwillingness for America to involve itself too greatly in wars on foreign fields? What's the politics of all of this?
I think the politics of the United States is more among a small part of the Republicans that have the House. There's a small handful of them who raise a big stink for political reasons. They're deconstructionists. They're doing this not because they are strong Putin supporters or they don't like Ukraine or fatigue or anything else. They're doing this primarily for American politics, domestic reasons. Among the American people, support of Ukraine is still very strong. It's really at least among the American population, maybe a 10, 15% that again are looking on this as is something that is more on a domestic scale, more on the lines of we just don't like Washington, we don't like government spending. It's not really something against Ukraine, but again, this is a smaller group among the American people, and in the House of Representatives, among those Republicans, there's not that many of them either. They're just very loud.
So you don't feel this will become a wedge issue as we head into primary season? We're still some way away from that, but an election is not that far away. You don't see Ukraine, America's commitment to this sort of foreign expenditure becoming a wedge issue?
I don't think so. I think a lot depends on what happens on the battlefield, and that means the next 6 to 8 months will be pretty crucial to make sure that Ukraine shows that it can keep pushing back on the Russians, reclaiming their land that's been occupied. I think it's going to be a tough fight ahead. And so right now we need to be behind Ukraine, and we need to make sure Russia knows that. And so I think if things go along on a positive trajectory, I think that's going to help keep Americans supporting Ukraine. If things go poorly and we get into a stalemate, a frozen conflict, I think there could be some fatigue there. But right now, supporting Ukraine is pretty popular. It's just among a vocal minority who are looking to cause trouble domestically in U.S. politics.
And just finally, Jim, how does the style of Boris Johnson go down? He looks like a sack of potatoes, sort of shambles up. he sort of really plays the bumbling Englishman abroad role for all that it's worth. Is that charming? What's the reaction just to the style of it all of Boris Johnson?
Well, like I said, in Washington, we know Boris Johnson for years, and so we don't look on him as shambling or as a foolish Englishman, that type of thing. I think we look on him as someone that has come with a very passionate message that makes sense to us today, right now. He didn't come to Washington with a far-fetched idea or with conspiracy theories
Yeah.
or spouting things. He was saying some things that I think were felt, and he said it with passion, and it was a stirring speech.
There we go. Strong endorsement of Boris Johnson there from Jim Townsend, former Vice President of the Atlantic Council and former Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO. And I can say he looks like a sack of potatoes because, of course, so do I.
Just a bit of clarification, of course, the Times' investigation